If you have a podcast, you know that major platforms like LinkedIn, Amazon, Apple, Google, Spotify are all looking for podcast content. I'll share with you why it's important to know how these channels work and to create your content in such a way that it continues to generate leads for you and your business. I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. Whether you're creating podcast scripts or materials for your clients or using a podcast to promote your own business, and when I say podcast, it includes periodic video content, periodic audio, any kind of supplemental media that may support your business. It's important to understand how major media platforms are scraping podcasts, organizing them, and then sharing them on their own platforms. Whether it's LinkedIn Learning, Amazon Audibles, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, there are so many different platforms. iHeartRadio, for example. So maybe you didn't know. This podcast, Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips, is available on audio. So the audiobook company, Audibles. It's available on LinkedIn Learning. It's available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. It's available on iHeartRadio. Technically, this is a radio show that can be syndicated on different radio channels across the country. It's available at a lot of places. There are thousands of listeners to this podcast and thousands of more listeners that don't ever make it to my website, because what's happening is these different broadcast platforms are using podcast content to kind of give an authoritative view on user-generated content. So rather than just having people chat back and forth and like social media who's selling advertising on your social conversations, these platforms are actually targeting an educated audience with content that is more form and function to be professional. Now, they're selling advertising on these podcasts, and you're creating the content. So how do we avoid you creating content for free? Well, there are actually 8 key functions that you want to have in every podcast. I'll try to demonstrate all 8 in this podcast. However, I'm going to speak specifically about 3 specific points. Now, where did I get this information from? Well, first, I'm Justin Hitt, Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. I have 4 podcasts. I create periodic content for the podcast in a sporadic manner. I used to do it every week, but now I'm so busy with clients, I tend to do 3 or 4 a day and then have an assistant drip out that content. I've been creating content in materials for other people and outlines that organizations will use as an editorial calendar to present their own podcast. I've also helped design training and tours for companies who want to use training as a way to educate potential buyers and then introduce different products and services. So Sun Microsystems, for example, used to have product training where you would get to use, systems administrators would use the latest equipment, and that was an opportunity to introduce that equipment to the technical decision maker. So I've created and helped create content that has to do with reaching specific niche audiences. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, with more than 250 podcast episodes that I've created for myself, I've learned a few things. Like, for example, my podcast suddenly shows up on another channel. And I get a little bit of credits on there, a little bit of citing. But again, there's 8 things you can do. I will cover 3 of them right now. When you record your podcast, you have to assume that your content will be syndicated. Syndication is not a new thing, but with YouTube being able to embed those videos elsewhere, with 4 or 5 different types of video sharing platforms, with 4 or 5 different types of podcast platforms, you can't assume that your target audience is reached in that platform that you're at. And it's going to cost a lot of money to build the traffic to your own website. And what if you could get the traffic that already exists in these platforms, and that the way your media was designed, it got picked up and would still bring people back to your website, still bring people back to your site itself. Now, again, I have 8 tips, which you can get in detail at www.adbriefings.co.uk, but I'll cover specifically 3, starting with name yourself and your guest. If you periodically call out who you are and why the listener should be paying attention and who your guest is, when your syndicator excerpts from your original podcast, you'll still periodically be there rather than an anonymous voice. You'll be a credible expert. Plus, with Google and different search engines, people can look up your name if they like the content. The next thing I want to point out is that you need ways to contact you, periodically pointing out who you are, where you can be reached, where people can send in questions. Questions is a great way. Even offering maybe a free tip sheet. Like I mentioned, there are 8 tips here on making your content benefit from aggregation and syndication. And if you want all 8 tips, you contact me through the website. Otherwise, here are 3. I'm really setting up the fact that there's more information. This podcast is a taste, and there's more information available in depth if you contact me. Now, I know a lot of you want to have a podcast that is educational, that delivers a lot of value. I think that's good, but it feeds the syndication monster. If you're creating excellent value in every podcast, which you should, but you're solving problems in those podcasts that don't help the reader get a full solution, I think what's going to happen is the syndication is going to package a bunch of people's content together. People are going to go off and do something with the content. Remember, these syndication platforms are selling advertising. They're selling subscriptions. They don't really care if your content is accurate. But I fear that the end user, if they use your content and it's very complex, they're going to have problems. And here's what I found works. You want to focus on the what and why. You want to share with what people should do and why they should do it. If they want the how, they need to raise their hand and contact you for more information, because the how is very situation dependent. Your podcast, your short form video, 10 to 15 minutes, really ought to set the decision maker up to making a very good decision. So again, a podcast is going to get syndicated. Think about it like a radio program, not a training program. Your podcast could get excerpted, so you want to make sure that people know who's speaking at the time. And periodically, you can just say, hey, look, I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. I'm Justin Hitt from Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. I'm Justin Hitt from so-and-so. And they do that early in the program and do that later as you close. But again, you want to build curiosity and connect with a specific prospect. They must listen to it and know it's for them. And these 3 things will get you really primed, because when you start getting picked up, you'll get more people to come to your site. Hey, I heard your podcast on Audible. They're listening to it in the car. They're listening to it on their desired platform. And ultimately, you can still be useful there rather than just fodder that channel's putting in place to sell advertising. Again, many of these concepts are similar to radio or television interviews. So if you have 2 parties in your podcast, you're doing an interview, you want to keep repeating who you're with so the audience knows who you are. You want to make sure so when you talk to your guests, you're going to talk to them by name. So Justin, tell me more about the 8 things that you need to know when you're doing podcasts that could be syndicated. You also want to think about this like a table topic. You got 2 to 3 minutes per each topic. And a simple podcast formula would be to introduce the topic, the benefits of the topic, answer 2 or 3 common questions, and then close with a call to action. Overall, when you've created materials, you have to understand the materials will have a greater life than just on your website. Same thing goes with a podcast. Same thing goes with a video log or any type of periodic content in any medium. And this can be good for you if you're following the 3 things that we pointed out here. Now, again, there are 8 specific items you can include in every podcast, video, or media newsletter, periodical. And if you'd like to get all 8, contact me at www.adbriefings.co.uk. Visit the website, go to the contacts page, drop me an email, drop me a fax or a letter, and just say that you're interested in 8 podcast content. Just when you contact me, you can also ask your questions about developing podcasts for yourself or your clients. But ultimately, this syndication is a good thing. Yes, they're using your content so that they can sell advertising. They're using your content to back end a membership site. But if your content is properly formatted and developed, you'll be able to still get customers. You'll still be able to get leads. In fact, you may even start partnership opportunities to create custom content for them or to support them on their copywriting side to get the memberships, because there's a lot of technical stuff they're doing. We can talk about it at another time. But ultimately, you want to make sure you get credit. I'd rather you be a credible expert than an anonymous voice. And if you're willing and interested and really desire to grow your copywriting business, well, I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips, and that's exactly what we do for existing copywriters. If you're a new copywriter, we can point you in the direction of resources, but if you're an existing copywriter and you've got a few assignments under your belt and you really want to start growing that business, there are things like content syndication. There are ways to reach media channels. There are ways to sell advertising on these channels, even sell advertising on competitors' podcasts, or more valuably, get clients who have 12 episodes, 24 episodes, rather than doing these one-off jobs. If you're interested in that and more, ask your questions at www.adbriefings.co.uk. Thanks for listening.